This is gonna look funny that the microphone is not working. Warriors of Virtue. I rephrase that is real confusing. Warriors of Virtue. It could have been any town anywhere in the country, a perfect picture postcard slice of suburban America, a typical middle-class neighborhood made up of modest homes on well-kept lawns, station wagons and minivans parked in almost every driveway. It was a warm, sunny Californian Saturday morning and the weekend routine had been substituted for the habits of a work week. Lawn mowers muttered throughout the neighborhood, a teenager or two worked in driveways washing cherished cars, people lounged in backyards enjoying an extra cup of coffee and a little longer with the morning paper than they allowed themselves on other days of the week. None of this was true, however, for the Jeffers household. Catherine Jeffers was a real estate agent, and Saturdays and Sundays were the busiest days of her work week. Added to that, her husband was out of town. That meant another long, parentless day for her 12-year-old son, Ryan. Catherine felt guilty about that, but she knew that she would feel even guiltier if she was not bringing in the money she made at her job. She shrugged off her guilt as best she could, telling herself that two-income families were just a fact of life these days. Catherine Jeffers checked the breakfast she had laid out on the kitchen, a steaming plate of scrambled eggs, a couple of strips of bacon, a pile of toast, and a tall glass of orange juice, then turned her attentions to her bulging briefcase. "Ryan, breakfast is on the table. Come on now." Catherine stuffed catalogues and papers into the attic case, but when there were far too many of them, from somewhere deep in the house came answer of sorts. "Okay." Her son sounded preoccupied, distracted. It was not an out-of-the-ordinary reaction from him these days, something Catherine Jeffers put down to a phase. "I've got to run," Catherine shouted. "I'll be home around 5. Okay." She waited a few moments. "Okay, Ryan," she repeated. She waited a few moments longer. Finally, "'K, bye." "Goodbye, honey." Catherine picked up the briefcase with one hand and scooped up an armful of catalogues with the other. Before leaving the kitchen she checked her appearance in the mirror. She was a pretty woman in her mid-30s, with a short page-boy haircut, sparkling blue eyes, and glasses that perched on the end of her nose. Catherine shrugged to herself. She couldn't change the way she looked, and bustled out of the kitchen, hooking the door closed with her foot. Her car, actually an oversized four-wheel drive Jeep with a cell phone, fax, laptop, computer, as well as change of clothes, cosmetics, and a ton of reference books and catalogs, which served as an office and studio apartment on wheels, was parked in the driveway, but with her hands full, opening the door on the driver's side presented something of a problem. She reached with a handful of catalogues, but succeeded only in dropping all of them. The booklets slithered out of her arm and scattered on the asphalt of the driveway. "Shoot," she said, as she knelt to pick them up. Ryan's dog, Bravo, a good-natured bear of golden retriever, came bounding out of nowhere and thrust his wet nose into her face. Bravo liked nothing more than interacting with humans, particularly members of the immediate family and the Jeffers. He figured that if Catherine was so close to the ground, his turf literally, then she must want to play. He bounced and capered and barked a little, trying to figure out what game it was she wanted to play. When she didn't give any clear sign, he moved in close to lick her face again, just to get her in the mood for some fun. "Bravo, no, get away from me, you dumb dog." Catherine did her best to fight him off. "Get the catalogues at the same time." "Bravo, no." She tried to push the dog's soft muzzle away. "Look, I have to tell you dog spit I don't need." Then she pointed over the shoulder back towards the Jeffers house. "Where's Ryan, Bravo? Go on, boy. Go find Ryan. Make sure he eats his breakfast for once, instead of you eating his breakfast for him." Bravo looked at her with sweet, gentle, but thoroughly uncomprehending eyes. He was not the smartest canine on earth, but even he had sort of figured out that Catherine was not in the mood to play just then. Bravo whimpered a little and backed up, watching as she gathered up her papers, opened the door of the car, and swept a pile of "For Sale" lawn signs off the back seat. "Go on, ask him to take you to that game of his," she said. That was another thing she felt guilty about. Because of her weekend work schedule, she almost never managed to make it to one of the junior high football games. If Catherine could be sure of two things about her son, one of them was this: he was fascinated by martial arts, karate, kung fu, judo, jujitsu. She wasn't really sure which one he was so devoted to. In her mom's mind, they were all more or less the same, weren't they? Whichever one it was, maybe it was all of them. Ryan's room was a riot of magazines, books, and posters, all devoted to the study and practice of Eastern techniques of self-defense. The space not devoted to the martial arts was given over to her son's other obsession, football. Ryan was football crazy. During the season, Ryan never seemed to miss a college game on Saturdays or pro game on Sundays. Monday nights, of course, were sacred, and the ball games were played at the end of the college season. Ryan had to be surgically removed from the couch in front of the television set. Super Bowl Sunday itself was something more akin to a religious experience than a sporting event. In addition to the pleasures of televised football, Ryan was involved in the sport in a practical manner as well. He was an integral part of the squad at his junior high school. At least Catherine liked to think of her son as being essential to the team's continual success. It was that he was a player, though. He was not the star quarterback, the fast, graceful receiver, or even a defenseman who stood between the other team and victory like a tall, wide slab of beef, impervious to pain. Ryan, along with his best friend Chucky, was the all-important water and towel boy for the team. Although his official title was assistant equipment manager, it was better than nothing. Ryan was slight and had been a delicate child growing up. It seemed that his early years had been one health crisis after another, and the childhood ailments and diseases that other kids went through without noticeable difficulty always seemed to hit Ryan hard. The measles, which other kids recovered from in a week, had laid poor Ryan low for 21 days. Mumps had taken even longer to shake, as had chicken pox. But those days were gone, signed to the ages 6 to 8. Ryan's real problems had come at birth, and no one knew anything about them until it was too late to do much. Ryan had begun to walk right when he was supposed to, around 18 months, but it was not until he was 2 that anyone noticed he had a slightly odd gait, and was prone to falling down even more than toddlers tended to do. A pediatric orthopedic surgeon had discovered that an intrauterine event had caused devastating damage to the neurological development of his right leg. A series of operations was recommended, but the results after 11 terrible weeks with Ryan in a cast enveloped his little body were found wanting. The left leg had turned out fine, but the right leg was still crippled and weak, and that led to the ugly leather and steel leg brace he had to wear from time to time, and a terminal case of the gilts as far as Catherine and her husband were concerned. As Ryan grew older and developed his all-consuming interest in sports, it became apparent that he would never play them. Catherine wondered if her son had chosen to get interested in the most physical of sports because he was slightly disabled, rather than turning his back on something that he would have be denied direct involvement in forever. She knew the limp and the brace bothered Ryan as far as she had never been teased about either. Still, it was no secret that the kids of Ryan's age, particularly the hulking, cocky football jocks, could be as cruel as a bunch of pre-adolescent Marquis sads. Catherine just about to start the engine when she felt a profound, sharp twinge of guilt. She sighed to herself, opened the car door, and walked back to the house. She opened the front door a crack and called out, "Ryan?" "Yeah," he answered. Her son was still seated somewhere in the deep house, apparently not having moved since she left. Breakfast, no doubt, was right where she'd left it on the table. "Have a good game, okay?" she called. "I love you." Okay, right at that moment, Ryan did not sound as if he really cared all that much. Catherine sighed again, retraced her footsteps out of the house to her car. Ryan was all right, she said to herself. He was just fine. It was just that he was a kid, and kids, it is well known, were extremely difficult to figure out in a meaningful way. Still, there was no way Catherine could ever quite escape the gnawing sense of guilt that was always always seemed to travel with her, the sense that somehow she had failed her only child. Bravo watched as Catherine backed the car out of the driveway. Then he turned and trotted back to the house. Bravo may not have been the most intelligent of dogs, but he knew how a few things worked, like the ease of getting through the front door of a suburban house. It was all in the nose. Bravo poked his long snout into the crack where the door met the frame with just enough force to unlatch it, opening up the front door. Then he wiggled his wide body through the crack he'd made vanished into the house. The dog padded through the entrance hall, pausing in the kitchen just long enough to snatch a piece of toast from the plate on the breakfast table, then moving on swiftly down the hallway to the rear where the bedrooms were. There was a good reason for Ryan's preoccupation, for his distance, for his general lack of interest in anything. His mother said to him that morning Ryan was reading. He was so deeply engrossed in his reading that nothing else could penetrate his mind. The world around him receded. He had forgotten what day it was. Saturday. Or he was bathroom, more precisely, actually on the toilet. He was reading about football, not this time, rather. The boy was engrossed in the other obsessions, the martial arts. It took a long time for Ryan to realize that he was being watched. Reluctantly, he tore his eyes from the page of his comic book and looked up to find Bravo standing right in front of him, the piece of toast still in his mouth, patiently waiting for Ryan to react. Ryan looked down at his comic book again. "Bravo, do you mind?" he said, instantly engrossed in his comic book again. The comic book was far more interesting than any dog, even a dog bearing breakfast, and Ryan's eyes raced through its brightly colored panels. The drawings were extravagant, enchanting, slightly fanciful scenes, the story of kung fu masters battling to death in a classic struggle of good versus evil. His mother may not have been able to tell karate from a bunch of carrots, judo from sumo wrestling, or kung fu from King Kong, but the distinctions for Ryan were as plain and as black and white. He was not interested in the first two, not at all. It was kung fu that enchanted him, the grace of the movements as well as the emphasis that the discipline put on the importance of right versus wrong, and the belief that morally upright and virtuous would always triumph over the base, corrupt, and evil. No matter how great the difference in power, it was comforting for a 12-year-old to be told that the good guys always win, no matter how hopeless the situation might appear, no matter how desperate the fight or the numbers of enemies ranged against you. The truth of it was Ryan didn't have too many friends, and if he could tell himself that he was always on the side of truth and right and justice, he would be able to get through his days with dignity and self-respect more or less intact. At least he hoped it worked that way, right then through the middle of the pretty exciting battle to the death, and he really did not want to be disturbed. Not by his mother, and certainly not by his dog. Something as completely mundane and boring as breakfast. Bravo did not see things that way, of course. He had been given his orders, and he was going to do his best to carry them out. He watched young master for a few more moments, and then with obvious canine disdain dropped to the toast in the middle of the comic book. That did it. The deposit of the slightly drool-sodden slice of toast smack dab in the middle of the story broke the spell. Ryan groaned, swept away the bread and the crumbs, realized it was time to say goodbye to the struggle of absolute good versus evil, unmitigated evil, turned himself to the more trying task of getting through the day. Imagine the hottest, most humid summer day, add the noise in the engine room, of an old tramp steamer plus the crush and the crowd of the commuter train at rush hour, put it all together and you have a fair idea of what the kitchen is like in the typical Chinese restaurants. Cramped, hot, and steamy, the kitchen of the Golden River Noodle Company was jammed with a dozen cooks toiling over 2 dozen woks. Deep vats filled with a sizzling oil, the food dancing and crackling in the heat, steam and smoke and the occasional small ball of flame filled the air, and slapped the clatter of spatulas and ladles on the blackened steel rang out like so much swordplay. It was not the kind of place you'd expect to find a 12-year-old kid hanging out, but everyone in the school thought there was some thing a little strange about Ryan Jeffers. Not weird strange, it was more that he seemed to have his own highly individual view of the world, his own specialized set of likes and dislikes, and one of them happened to be tucking himself into the corner of the kitchen at the Golden River Noodle Company, and watching the action, and the food was good too. The kitchen seemed to go day and night like a blast furnace. People wanted Chinese food at the most peculiar times, and it seemed to be the utmost importance to the Golden River staff that they get it now. To add to the confusion, everyone seemed to be talking at once and loudly too. The cooks bellowed at the assistants, who yelled right back. The waiters and waitresses stormed into the kitchen as if attacking it, yelled out orders for the cashiers and curses at the cooks for not being fast enough with the food. No one seemed to like anyone else. There were real intense likes and dislikes from time to time, although these were rare. The first time Ryan squeezed into the kitchen, he had expected physical fights to break out among the cooks, between the waiters and the cooks every 5 minutes. Of course, it never happened. Still, it looked and sounded like barely contained riot. In a corner were the two cashiers, two women bent over two cash registers, telephones permanently attached to their ears, their fingers flying over the keys, keeping track of every transaction like recording angels. Two other phones rang constantly. The first time Ryan Jeffers had seen the kitchen of the Golden River, he had been amazed that anything, let alone complex and delicious meals, came out of such confusion and chaos. It did not seem possible that these hot toiling cooks, snarling waiters could possibly communicating, or that the cashiers could cut through all the noise and tumult to remember to record that table 6 had ordered a double order of brown rice. The pandemonium of the kitchen was certainly entertaining to a 12-year-old Ryan, and he tried to stop in for a visit whenever he could, but each time he returned he was amazed that the place was still in business. Gradually, though, Ryan began to notice that what happened to be a riot in a kitchen was in fact a carefully ordered system which turned out meals with efficiency of an assembly line. Each person in that narrow room